Ivan Lewis.
Thank you very much, Mr Gray. It's always a pleasure to speak in a debate under your chairmanship. Can I congratulate the honourable member for securing this debate and for his extraordinary account of what he learnt as a consequence. I care passionately about this issue, as I think other honourable members do on this side, because it's the ultimate symbol of the gross inequality which scars our country, but also, in my case, the city region of Greater Manchester. We're proud of the Renaissance of Manchester, but we can't celebrate the cranes in the sky, which represent growth and development, while so many people are sleeping in shop doorways before our eyes. This issue also matters to me because in the 1960s, a middle-aged woman was found sleeping in a Manchester park with her young twins. The police officer who found her said, "You can sleep here, madam, but the children can't," and they were whisked into care. That middle-aged woman was my grandmother, who was a war widow battling with mental health problems, and the twins, my uncle and aunt. And I think the point I would want to make is this can happen to anybody and anybody's family. Why do we face such a shocking situation? A situation which, in my view, is a repeat of the No Such Thing as Society 80s and 90s. The honourable member has listed the whole range of people who could be rough sleepers, and I think it's important to underline that we need to look at this on an individual-by-individual basis. There are many, many causes. The only comment I would want to make, two comments. One about foreign nationals. Of course, they're not eligible for public funding, which creates a whole range of problems for the system. There are many people in that category who are not eligible for any public funding. I would also say to the honourable gentleman, I don't think he meant to say that you're better off sleeping on the streets than being in the military. I mean, that would be a great indictment, I think. I will certainly give way.
That sleeping in central London, if you are able-bodied, was no worse than being on exercise in the military. It certainly wouldn't be if you were mentally ill or drug addicted or whatever else.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that clarification.
It must be.
Can I talk about the consequences of the slash-and-burn approach that have decimated public services as a consequence of this government's policies? The rhetoric is all about a shift to prevention and early intervention. The reality is that the slashing and burning of local authority budgets mean that they are reduced to providing their minimum legal responsibilities. So prevention and early intervention, frankly, goes out of the window. And as for voluntary organisations, we no longer hear the term the big society. And the reason that the big society was killed, dropped, never mentioned, was because at the same time the government was talking about the growth in the importance of voluntary organisations, they were slashing funding that those voluntary organisations depended upon. So it was an absolute nonsense to talk about the big society. And of course, the whole alleged commitment to localism has been proved to be a complete nonsense. If you were running if you were running a business, Mr. Gray, and you had a 50% cut in your budget over 4 years, you would go bankrupt or are likely to go out of business. That is what is happening to local authorities under all political direction up and down this country. And we are now paying an incredibly heavy price for it. So I welcome the ring-fence money that the government has made available to tackle these issues, also especially in Greater Manchester. But the irony of that, the money is not adequate, but it's only necessary because of the impact of their own social policy failures and cuts. It's right, therefore, that in a debate like this, we don't say take the politics out of it. The reason that we have a rough sleeping epidemic in our society is as a direct consequence of political decisions that have been made. However, I always believe it's incumbent on opposition to also offer creative and positive solutions. And I believe that Greater Manchester deserves tremendous credit for the innovative approach they're taking under the Mayor's leadership, Andy Burnham, working with the 10 local authorities, the voluntary sector, faith groups and the private sector. The Mayor's ambitious and morally right commitments to end rough sleeping by 2020. That's 7 years ahead of the government's commitment. The government is only committed to ensuring that nobody has to sleep on the streets of this country by 2027. I would argue that is massively lacking ambition in terms of the humanitarian crisis that we face in this country. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I just wanted to say that I think mayors across the country have a role to play. Obviously, we heard about
Sadiq Khan and you've talked about Andy Burnham, but Andy Street in the West Midlands Combined Authority made homelessness the first thing that he addressed in his time as mayor.
I would congratulate Andy Street on making this a priority, but I would say that all of the mayors, if the honourable gentleman was meeting with them, would say that the problems that they face is as a consequence of the breakdown in the frontline services that many of the people that we're talking about have traditionally depended upon. So I'm afraid I agree the mayors have an important role to play. I'm very proud of the groundbreaking approach that Andy Burnham is taking, which everybody acknowledges. So what are the key elements, Mr Gray? And then I'll bring things to a conclusion. What are the key elements of a successful approach? Well, first of all, high-level political leadership. It's absolutely important that the people at the top care about rough sleeping and care about homelessness and make it a priority. Co-production of solutions with people who have lived experience and people and organisations on the front line. This should never be about solutions which are top-down. A clear strategy and plan focused on reduction, respite, recovery and reconnection. As the honourable gentleman said, a personalised approach across organisational boundaries with key workers, support plans and personal budgets. Also, innovative, imaginative public services. Really proud of the innovative work the NHS and the fire service, for example, are doing in Greater Manchester. Expanded housing provision. But sometimes that will need specialist provision. The honourable gentleman said this is mainly about men. But therefore, what about specialist provision for women who are fleeing often domestic abuse and also for young people? There is a dearth of that provision in communities up and down this country. There is also a key role for business. The corporate sector in most communities want to help. And it's very, very important that the statutory authorities find a vehicle for businesses to make a positive contribution through their expertise and their skills, but also their willingness to make available financial resources. In Greater Manchester, the Mayor's Fund and Big Change has been very successful in putting together resources from a variety of sectors on a ring-fenced basis. I agree with the honourable gentleman that having put in place all of those support services and rebuilding that infrastructure, it's also important to tackle the problems of spice, which is another epidemic, which I don't think as a society we're yet clear about how to tackle. And I also agree with the honourable gentleman, when we have been successful in minimising the number of people on the streets, of course it's appropriate we take on the issue of begging. People who have addresses but are on the streets and are begging and are not actually homelessness. But I don't believe that's the place to start. The place to start in terms of public support is to make sure we minimise the number of people who are rough sleeping. So, Mr Gray, in conclusion, I believe that in the same way as post-war, we as a society reached a consensus that every citizen in this country should have access to free healthcare and universal education. It's about time we offered the same right as part of citizenship, so every citizen should have the right to a decent and affordable home in our society.
That was nearly 9 minutes, squeezing out two colleagues. Derek Thomas.